Welcome into the College Football Overtime Podcast. My name is Garrett Chapman. His name is Abe Gordon. This is the Week 10 recap show. A wild week, a big, very important week. We're going to get into all of it. Ohio State's out duels Penn State. Very important matchup there in the Big Ten. Oregon pummels Michigan. We got Georgia skating by the skin of their teeth. South Carolina also throws a wrench into the Texas A&M schedule. Plus, it's a brutal week for teams who are vying for 2 bids. And it's going to be a lot to get into. So let's just dive right in. But before we do that, I got to welcome in my co-host. He's been gone for a week. Abe Gordon. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good, man. I was at one of the games that we're going to be talking about. Had a great time there. Can chat obviously about what happened on the field there at the cocktail party. But look, I'll be honest, the game kind of become understood towards the end. And I was just on my phone watching what was going down in the Big 12, in the ACC, and with Atlanta United, if we're going to be honest as well. So I did not miss much. Despite being on the road, I did not miss much.
You never do. Abe Gordon is the kind of guy who he's got a TV screen for every wall, every piece of open area in his house. He has another television that's just up there chilling. So I would never expect him to miss a single bit of action. That's why he's perfect for the College Football Overtime Podcast. But let's jump right here. This is the big one of the week. Ohio State survives Penn State 20-13. They get that win. Will Howard was really under the microscope in this game as well as everybody else on this Ohio State team. I kind of put him on blast a bit here, Abe. Just for full disclosure, I said that this team they were expected to be a very good football team, right? That's what they are. They're a very good football team. But then there's that next level of like what an Ohio State team is supposed to be and what they're supposed to do on a week in, week out basis. And after they did what they did against Nebraska, which effectively was not much, they were kind of falling short of expectations. And then in this game, a lot of people started really questioning whether Ohio State was the team that was going to be up for the challenge to potentially contend for and win a national championship. They looked like they were skating through this one just a little bit. They never really pulled away at any point in this game. Penn State was always in and around this game. They always had an opportunity. Plus, you have Drew Aller, who is continuing to deal with this injury. And Will Howard was okay. He was fine. But more importantly, the rushing attack found its legs. They go for 179 yards in this one. 2013 winners. Ohio State reasserts its claim as one of the top dogs in the Big Ten Conference.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll get to Penn State and the questions James Franklin has to answer in a moment, because I know you have those questions, and you've continued to have those questions accurately since the start of the season. For Ohio State, there's this premise that they were this great team, right? They're one of the favorites to win a national championship. They go on the road. They lose in heartbreaking fashion to Oregon, but it's a close game. You still come out saying that's a darn good football team. They have not looked impressive since that game against Oregon, and certainly that Nebraska game that you referenced made you raise some eyebrows and say, hey, maybe Penn State's got a shot in this one, to the point where you say, hey, play this thing at night. Maybe it's a different outcome, a different officiating crew. Maybe it's a different outcome. But at the end of the day, Ohio State just feels slightly disconnected on offense. It doesn't feel like they're off by much, but, there's one play where Jeremiah Smith stops running and then has to restart his route. And it's like, man, if he keeps running, that's a touchdown. There's another play where you see Will Howard, and if the throw's slightly to the inside of the field instead of the outside, maybe that one's a touchdown. So things were just a smidge off in the pass game, and I think it affected the totality of that offensive performance from the Buckeyes. But in the key moments, right, and there were a couple of key moments, especially in the second half, a couple even right before halftime. But in the key moments, Ohio State won. And I think that was the real difference in this game. These two teams, for the most part, look like relative equals. But in the very few key game-turning moments, it seemed like it was Ohio State coming out with the advantage more often than not. And that's quite frankly all that decided this game. It was very competitive. I think, look, I know where you're going to head, and I don't blame you for heading there. I thought this looked like a different Penn State team. I don't necessarily say they should feel ashamed with the outcome of this game, but you're still now left answering the same questions we thought you would have to answer. And at some point that becomes a problem. I'll let you take it from there. I thought this was a good win for Ohio State.
Yeah.
Not great though.
Yeah, I mean, and if you're James Franklin, I mean, the pressure's been on him to really get over the hump against Ohio State and against Michigan. He won't have the opportunity to do that against Michigan this season, but he did have the chance to do this here against Ohio State. It's not acceptable to be very clearly little brother in this rivalry. He's 1-10 against Ohio State. He hasn't won this game since 2016. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. And I mean, Penn State seems like they are just mostly just okay with them skating by and just not being the team to get it done. But it's more just the fact that a lot of the problems that Penn State's had this season reared its ugly head again. It's whenever they just don't get that rushing attack going, there doesn't seem to be another option for them. You know, and I'm looking specifically at Katrin Allen and Nicholas Singleton, who were downright dreadful in this game. I talked about Will Howard, and it's because I expect a whole heck of a lot from Will Howard, you know, the Ohio State quarterback. He throws a pick six on his first pass attempt of this game, and then he was fine for the rest of the game. Like, he was okay. Like, in considering the fact his offensive line is dreadful, Penn State wasn't really able to make them pay for it. But Penn State's rushing attack, I expected to be at least a little bit better in this game. Ohio State, one thing that they have done, we've talked about the offense specifically, but it's their inability to get off the ground. The defense for Ohio State is fantastic. Tyler Warren can't be leading you in rushing. That's unacceptable. Drew Aller can't be your second leading rusher. Katrin Allen and Nicholas Singleton need to be better. It's just too simple for them, because we saw that happen against USC. We saw it happen it happened against Wisconsin too. They weren't very good on the ground. I just, this is your identity, and if it's your identity and you don't do it effectively enough, I don't know who they are anymore. Maybe if Drew Aller was healthier, we'd be singing a different tune. Maybe this game would have gone just a little bit differently. But dude played the whole game. I can't give him too many excuses. And everyone's hurt. Everyone gets banged up. Things happen. And I'm impressed that he was even able to go in this game. But it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. And until Penn State realizes that, they're just going to continue. I don't see them getting better. I mean, are they going to be better next year than they were this year? I don't know. But they're once again on the outside looking in on the Big Ten championship. Doesn't matter if they're divisions, doesn't matter what the formula is. It just seems like they're in the same spot. They're on a treadmill right now.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think you're right to an extent. At some point, I looked up. Drew Aller was the leading rusher, and I think it was Singleton, although it may have been Allen, was the leading receiver. And I know over the course of that game, but yeah, I think the guys outside, they needed to step up. I don't know how much of this is on Drew Aller and the injuries. The receivers are not good enough, and
they're not getting open.
Yeah, I know.
It's Tyler Warren, and then it's a bunch of nobodies, and they're just sort of.
And that's not on Aller, and that's not necessarily on Singleton or Allen either. I mean, it becomes a point where Ohio State's able to play four defensive backs and put everyone else up in the box to stop the run. If you got seven in the box, I don't know if we can blame Allen and Singleton. I agree. They need to be better. They need to run against loaded boxes. They've been doing it their whole careers. That should have been no different on Saturday, but you've got to get something going in the pass game, and it just wasn't there. I do want to say about Will Howard, he throws that early pick six. They respond very well, and I do think you have to give them credit, because it felt like you're down what? That was 10-0, I think. And you're down immediately, and you're saying, man, if we go 3 and out here, we could be in real trouble on the road against the number 4, number 3 ranked team in the country. And he responded very well. They eventually took a 14-10 lead. And so I do want to give him credit for that. And they kind of coasted a little bit from there, but just a good response after a very costly mistake, and something that kind of made you open your eyes after the opening field goal for Penn State. And it says, oh boy, Buckeyes are already stepping in it, but they came out of that quite well. And yeah, look, it's not any more reassuring to sit here and say you guys looked more competitive against Ohio State this year than you had in recent years. And this one felt like it could have gone a different way if one or two calls had gone differently, or one or two moments had been in your favor, that doesn't help you out. And if you're James Franklin, it's still the same story. Yes, you were better. You were more competitive. You weren't completely run off the field by this team. But at the end of the day, you're Penn State. You're a top 5 team. There's no moral victories in a loss.
No.
You know, that can happen for other teams in different situations. It can't happen for you. So no matter how close this game felt, no matter how even this game felt, the same way there's no real moral victory for Ohio State when they lost to Oregon, there's no moral victory here for Penn State either. And yeah, I don't know what the answer is, you know, because there's only one other option, right? And that is at some point changing your head coach.
Yeah.
But
I'm not
boy,
calling for that. I just want to make
no,
sure.
and I don't know if Penn State fans should be either. And I understand what Penn State has been in the past. How many programs do we need to see fire a guy that's kind of getting it done to then just completely fall off? Like, yeah, maybe you fire Mark Richt and you find Kirby Smart and you become the program in college football, right? But like, there's so many more examples of guys that have been fired and the program has become completely non-existent. And I would be absolutely terrified if I were a Penn State fan. And I get it. You always think your school's going to make the right hire. You always think you get better. But man, oh man, you're one coach away from becoming what Nebraska was for 25 years. And it's just like Nebraska maybe now just finally feels like they're on the edge of getting back there from the Tom Osborne days. That was a long time, man. Like, you had a long time of being college football royalty that was in no man's land. And it'd be a shame to see Penn State fall the same way. And it's just like, man, that'd be terrifying for me.
Yeah, and that's the other thing with Nebraska. I do want to mention this too. Scott Frost was dreadful. They fired Bo Pelini back maybe a decade ago at this point, but then they just went into a dumpster fire. But Matt Rule, I will say this: he's now 0-7 against with Nebraska when they're trying to get to bowl eligibility. They lose again, and I just want to mention that really quickly. UCLA loses 27, or UCLA beats them 27-20. But the grass is not always greener for teams who want to fire their head coach. And I don't think that there is necessarily a path to getting better by firing James Franklin, because I think Penn State has reached this level of just solid football team. And especially if this new era of college football where you have this 12-team playoff, expectations have to change just a little bit, because winning a national championship is going to be a lot more difficult, but more teams are going to have a bite at that apple. And that's just sort of, it opens up the door for them. Now, if they lose another game this season, then you start chatting a little bit more. I don't think it's hot seat territory. I just think it's just a growing frustration that exists with the Penn State fan base. And you look at this schedule too, by the way, your best win right now is an Illinois team that's continuing to scuffle a little bit. You lose another game, they're not making the college football playoff. I would not be surprised if that happens, because Ohio State's in that sort of territory too. If Ohio State loses a second game, it's not really that good of a resume. You have a 1-point loss to Oregon. You have a tight win on the road against Penn State. That's great. Then you might have a loss to Indiana later on this season. Assuming that happens, it's just sort of top heavy in the Big Ten. A lot of those middling teams, the teams that could be contending for at-large bids in the Big Ten Conference, they're not really looking nearly as good as you would want them to. I'm looking at USC. I'm looking at Illinois. I'm looking at Nebraska, which has continued to falter here as of late. But your mid-level, your top-level teams, though, continue to be really good. And then the rise of Indiana has been very pleasant to see. But the Buckeyes, they win this one. They are right back in the driver's seat. One other game in the Big Ten Conference I do want to mention here, talking about those mid-level teams, the Michigan Wolverines are a bad football team. And they're supposed to be able to run the football, at least at some level. Donovan Edwards, he gets it done, sort of, 52 yards for him. But that's really the only positive about this game. Davis Warren, they go back to him in the starting quarterback position. He has 164 yards and 2 touchdowns, but they get absolutely blasted here by Oregon. Oregon's clearly the class of the conference, and they get up to a 28-10 halftime lead, and it was all she wrote. And when I talked about this game, it was very clear that if Michigan was going to have a path to a win in this game, they had to make it ugly. And if they get back down to a 2, and it looks like they had an opportunity to potentially do that at the end of the first quarter, but Oregon just lays it on 21 points in that second quarter. And it was just all she wrote, because Michigan, if they're not running the football at a really high level, then that's about it. They're pretty bad. It's just not a good team this year.
Yeah, look, the quarterback play's been all over the place all season long. This game was no different. Orgy was in, and who knows what was going on. You know, he was getting hurt, and other guys came in, and they didn't look much better. You know, it just doesn't seem to matter who they run out there at quarterback. But look, the other interesting aspect of this, and like props to Oregon, like they obviously move on and they're doing their thing. But Michigan's got a trip to Indiana, and that's one of the few games that Indiana – you kind of look at as in danger mode, and that's coming up this coming week. I mean, we talk about teams in the Big Ten. Indiana's the one that has jumped Penn State, and they've got this game against Michigan. They've got a game against Ohio State, and if Ohio State plays like they have against some of these other teams, they could drop that game. It's going to be really, really interesting in the Big Ten. The race is still on. Like, that's the one thing that's interesting. Like, Penn State's not out of it. Ohio State is kind of in a driver's seat, maybe, but they got to take care of Indiana. Oregon's really the only one that feels like they're in a really good spot to get to the Big Ten title game. But the race is certainly on in the Big Ten.
Quickly, I do want to talk about Indiana beating Michigan State. This is the first time all season that they've trailed. They go down 10-0 early in this game to the Spartans, but then they scored 47 unanswered points. 47 unanswered points. And Curt Cignetti's squad, we've said it on this podcast, it's been talked about a lot. All he does is win. The dude is everything advertised and then some. He might be one of the best coaches in America as of right now. He is a runaway favorite to win Coach of the Year, in my opinion. I mean, Curtis Rourke has been nothing short of spectacular here under center. He's back healthy. And you're playing a pretty good Michigan State team. That's not a bad team. That's not a team that's just a bunch of slappies over there on the other side. And Aiden Giles, he's been healthy, or he's come back healthy. He had 193 yards, but you pick him off twice. You hold them to, get this, Abe, negative 36 yards rushing. So it's not even the fact that it's the offense doing it. It's the fact that the defense has been playing at, truthfully, an elite level. I'm just so blown away by what Indiana has been able to do.
Yeah, and that's been the revelation for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we've kind of talked about it since they really hosted game day and jumped. Really, the Nebraska game was kind of when they jumped into it. You're like, man, if the defense is playing like this, and you know the offense is going to score in the mid-30s, if not into the 40s, which they did again in this one, why not Indiana to compete? And I'm not saying maybe with Oregon or with Georgia, but are they where Penn State is? Are they where Tennessee and Alabama are, and BYU? And I think you've seen in the AP poll that's come out, Sunday afternoon, that look, they're up to number 8 in the country right now. And I we're going to do our top 12. I have them high. And you look at the teams behind them, I'm like, I don't know if I'd pick any of those teams over Indiana right now. In fact, I would consider putting them above some of the teams I have in the top 5. And so we'll get into it in a little bit. But, the defense playing at the level it is, along with the offense humming, they're dangerous. They're dangerous. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it.
There is a very real chance, though, that if they, in this season with the loss to Ohio State, they finish the season without a single win against a team who got a vote in the AP poll. It's worth mentioning. It doesn't lessen what they've been able to do necessarily. I think if they go get a win against Ohio State, I think there's a very real chance that they are right up. I mean, look, they're clearly be an at-large team at that point, but they've been a very fun team to follow, and I very much, I know it's your alma mater, and I've very much enjoyed watching them play. But one game that I'm sure that neither side was really too happy with the outcome of this game. Georgia escapes Florida 34-20. Don't let the scoreline deceive you either, because this game was tied up at 20 with about 5 minutes left to go in the game. I know the Georgia fans were sweating. I know Florida fans were celebrating, but thinking about what could have been, DJ Lagway leaves this game with an injury. He gets carted off the field. Aiden Warner comes in. He was not very good, but he's a third-string quarterback. It's about what you'd expect in that kind of game, and he led the team to a potential comeback. Well, they came back, and Georgia continues to not be a very good first-half team. They go to the locker room 13-6 deficit, a 13-6 deficit. And I mentioned on this podcast beforehand, Abe, while you were on vacation off gallivanting across the seven seas, and I said that Billy Napier he might mess around and save his job. And I think he's gonna get a win, at least one win that he's not supposed to over his next couple of the next slog where you got to play LSU, you got to play Texas. I mean, it's tough. It's tough. You got to play Ole Miss, and then you got to play Florida State. You got to get 2 wins out of that. You got to go to a bowl game. I don't know. I think they're a better team than their record might indicate. They're 28-3 is the record of their 4 losses this season. It's Miami, it's Florida, or excuse me, it's Texas A&M, it's Georgia, and it's Tennessee. And I know that no one's going to give you any moral victories. There are no victories in defeat, but that's a better football team than I think the record might indicate. Billy Napier, I think he was buried, dead and buried. He was gone, but I think he's coached his way into a potential saving of his job. And or am I wrong in that calculation?
Well, it's going to be impossible to gauge. You're playing a walk-on transfer quarterback who played at Yale. This guy is not built for SEC play. It will help that you'll have a week to prepare him and whatnot, but it seems like the hamstring injury to DJ Lagway is relatively severe. I don't know if it's season-ending, but pretty severe. I don't think what's his name, Adrian Wayner, whatever it is, something like that. I don't think he's walking into DK Royal Stadium and beating Texas. Warner, sure. There's an R in there. I just don't think he's walking into Texas and winning that game. And so it's impossible to gauge Billy Napier and what can happen the rest of the season. I'll say this for Florida fans. Very unfortunate because deprived the potential of a monumental upset. And this is obviously a different game if DJ Lagway is playing in the second half. It's also a different game if Billy Napier had a little bit more guts. And the decision to try a 50-plus yard field goal early in the third quarter, snap goes awry and Georgia takes over in Florida territory. I mean, they lost 35 yards on that play. It was 4th and 2. You have to go for it. And I know you kicked a long field goal right before half, but you did that because the clock was working against you and it was before half. I thought you had to go for it in that moment. They didn't. It certainly cost them. But for Florida, defense played inspired once again. It did fall apart a little bit in the second half as they were back on the field and back on the field and back on the field with Warner being unable to sustain a drive. They had the one made up of a couple big plays. But Georgia showcased a couple of the issues that we've seen. Too many 7, 8, 9, 10-yard runs for the Florida Gators. Obviously, Carson Beck is a problem, and it's just tough to defend winning a national championship with a quarterback that's going to turn the ball over like that. 3 turnovers, although I do think the last one from him, he was hit pretty good as he was throwing. The ball kind of got popped up, but there were 2 turnovers before that. One was thrown into triple coverage, and it's just like, what are you doing? But at the same time, I think we've seen there's been times where if Kirby Smart was going to make a quarterback change, he would have. He's not going to do it, at least not in my opinion.
No.
And so you're kind of just stuck hoping that in the big plays, in the big moments, Carson Beck can be because we've seen him be very good. At times he has, but at other times he just completely loses focus and puts the ball in danger way too often. And you're just hoping in the big games if you can reach the playoffs or the Final Four, an SEC title game, 1, you don't start this slow in the first half, and 2, that he doesn't turn the ball over with the enormity that he has in recent weeks. But I mean, what does he have? 4 multi-interception games? I mean, yeah, it's more than that. So he's got to clean it up. There's no doubt about it because I thought the rest of the supporting cast was there. I just thought he wasn't good enough to make it an easy win, but it was a win for Georgia. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, you do what you have to do. You won a pretty heated and respected rivalry game. And whether it's not your fault that DJ Lagway goes down, I mean, you kept your focus and fought through it. And it wasn't handed to Georgia. It certainly would have helped if Lagway is there for Gators fans, but it wasn't handed. They showed some fight, and they had a scoring drive of their own in the moments with Warner as the backup. But would have liked to have seen Lagway. I think a lot of people, both at the stadium and probably watching at home, a lot of people believe Florida wins this game, but DJ Lagway does not get hurt. I don't know if that's the case, but they would have at least given themselves a chance. I didn't think they had a chance when he was out.
Yeah, and I will say this too, because Florida does tie this game, and I'm going to talk about Carson Beck because it warrants talking about. It warrants further conversation. When the lights come on and the lights get big and they need a clutch play, Carson Beck has been a great player. Florida ties this game up at 20. 5 minutes left in this game. Georgia needs a drive. They need big plays. That's where he shined. And I don't understand what changes for him in those instances, because he finds Arian Smith and then he connects with that one for 25 yards or something like that. And then they just rolled. From that point, they just rolled all the way down the field. Very, very similar to what they did against Texas on the road in that game, where Texas cuts into it. He throws ironically another interception. And Texas cuts into a 1-score game. They need an answer. He drives them down the field. He brings it back up to 2 scores. And that was all she wrote in that game, right? He does it again in this game. He drives them down, gets the intercept, or he throws the interception, or he continues throwing interceptions. Florida comes back out. They tie it up, and then he drives them down the field, and then they get the pick. And then they ice the game with their second touchdown with like about 2 minutes or something to go in the game. And the game, that was all she wrote at that point. But I don't know what it is about him in these other moments, because Carson Beck cannot be throwing these interceptions, because you're cutting into your team's ability to win football games, because they were moving the ball. Like, Georgia was moving the ball very effectively. The offense looks like it's got the pieces, and they were humming. Nate Frazier, he was cooking on the ground. I know that you lose Trevor Etienne to a rib injury. That's going to be very important to follow, because those are pesky injuries for a running back. But I mean, he offsets it with 309 yards and 2 touchdowns, but it's unacceptably bad. It just means that he doesn't trust his weapons, and he's forcing it into windows that he shouldn't be doing it. And maybe it's just the fact that he misses Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, which, I mean, look, anybody would, but his regression has been so bad, and it's cost Georgia the ability to win football games. It cost them that game against Alabama, and it very nearly cost them against Texas. It nearly cost them this game against Florida. It nearly cost them against Kentucky. It's inconsistent. But when he's at his best, you've seen how good of a slinger he is. The dude can throw the ball all over the field, but it's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. If you are not dominant, you can't lose the turnover battle as badly as you've been doing it. Now, if you're Florida, I hate it for them. I mean, losing DJ Lagway. Has there been an update on Lagway and his status for the rest of the season? Do you know?
No, I haven't seen any updates on the hamstring. They knew pretty immediately it was decently severe, but I haven't seen any actual timeline yet.
Yeah. Well, if you're Florida, you know what you got to do. You got to win at least 2 of your next 4 games, right? And the going gets no easier. But if you're Georgia, you also got to slog in these next 2. You're on the road in Oxford, Mississippi. You're taking on a Jackson Dart-led team that just pummeled Arkansas. They're playing at a really high level. Then you get Tennessee, and you get a ruthless defense. You don't think they'd be more than happy to turn you over a couple of times? You got to get through these next 2 weeks. I don't think Georgia Tech's going to have the firepower anymore to really contend with you this season. UMass, I mean, come on. But Ole Miss and Tennessee, it's if they play like they did on Saturday, I would not be surprised if they lose both of those games. I wouldn't put it past them, especially in this year of the SEC, where we've seen some of these wild results. Ole Miss can throw the ball all over the yard. They're going to put a lot of pressure on that defense. Your pass rush needs to be playing at a really high level, but the offense cannot continue to turn the ball over. It's that simple. It looks like they're starting to find their form in every category except for the quarterback position, which is so ironic because that was the biggest strength coming into the season. But let's move into another game here in the SEC. South Carolina, they go on the road, or they defend home field. Texas A&M goes on the road. They get absolutely smothered by the Gamecocks. Lenora Sellers plays the game of his life. He finishes with 106 yards on the ground. He gets a touchdown there on the ground. Lenora Sellers also throws for 244 yards and 2 touchdowns. Marcel Reed gets the start for Texas A&M. He looks like he's in over his skis. And this is one of the reasons why Marcel Reed wasn't the starting quarterback. They got after him. They really they hit him. They hit him a lot. And I mean, that defensive line for South Carolina is as good as advertised and then some. And in Columbia, South Carolina, you go play out there. It's one of the toughest places to play. I predicted this game. We talked about this on College Football Game Time on Sports Radio 92.9 The Game. I talked about it a lot on this podcast on our preview show on Thursday. I was all over South Carolina on this one. They just needed to have a big game from Lenora Sellers, and that's exactly what they got.
Boy, I'll tell you what. A lot of things went wrong for Texas A&M in this one, including the unavailability of Wegman. Obviously, that certainly impacted what they were able to do on offense. But as did South Carolina's defensive line, which we've talked about for quite a while. But man, the place where it all went wrong for me in regards to A&M was Rocket Sanders. And you mentioned Lenora Sellers as well, but those two guys combined for about 250 on the ground. It was the best game of the season for Sanders by far. And well, I got to sneeze in a sec. It's coming at some point. But man, oh man, like that's where it all went wrong for me. I think you can live with what in general you got from Marcel Reed, right? 200 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. You got a 145 on the ground. Like, you put up 20 points, obviously needs to be a little bit more, and there were some points left out there, but defense didn't give you much of an opportunity. It just felt like South Carolina got rolling, and every time A&M was looking for a big stop, every time they wanted a third down to get off the field, it was hand to Sanders, and it wasn't like 3 or 4 yards. It was like 10, 12. I mean, he was really cutting him up. He had a 52-yarder there as well, so between him and Sellers, it was the rushing defense from A&M that decided this game in favor of South Carolina.
100%. 100%. And you get those fans rushing the field. It was some pretty awesome scenes over there in Columbia, and I really enjoyed that. And great call out here on Raheem Sanders. Rocket Sanders. Hey, you there? All right, we are back. I had a little technical difficulty there for just a second. But look, Raheem Rocket Sanders has been very good at times and very average, if not pedestrian, at other times. But big win here for South Carolina. The Cox are now just 1 win reaching bowl eligibility. And you got to win. You got that matchup against Wofford coming up later on this season. I think they should be just fine. But they get to go on the play those pesky Vanderbilt Commodores who continue to play at just a very high level. I loved this scene. This game was so much fun to watch. And it was just a fantastic football game. Tough one for Texas A&M. Just felt like it's one of a prototypical type of game that they're going to drop. But let's move into the rest of the country too, because this is extremely important for the ACC. Let's go. We're just going conference by conference, and we've done the Big Ten. We've talked about the SEC. Louisville beating Clemson is really, really bad. It's a brutal week for teams vying for 2 bids, specifically the Big 12 and the ACC. Louisville, they run past Clemson 33-21. Isaac Brown, he steals the show. He gets 151 yards and a touchdown. But the Cardinals snapped. They were 0-8 against Clemson, and they snapped an 11-year home winning streak for the Tigers. But it was Tyler Shugg and Isaac Brown. They got a lot of the acclaim coming into this game, and rightfully so. But they kind of sat back, and they were more caretakers than anything else because the defense stifled Clemson outside of Phil Maffa, who goes buck wild in this game. But the Clemson offense had been averaging near 50 points per game, and then they blocked 2 field goals. Louisville just felt like they were riding a train of emotion, and good for them because this was a huge win for
It was a very odd game because you looked at the stats. I would think that Clemson wins this thing comfortably. You talked about it, but I mean, this is a situation where you out threw uh, uh, Louisville by a little margin. You outran them by a little margin. You didn't have turnovers. It looked just in the box score on its own that Clemson should have won this game the way they've been beating all these other teams. You mentioned it. Malfa went off more than
Yeah.
he has in recent weeks, but that was not the case. And Louisville fought back in that third quarter, man. That trio of field goals to kind of separate them all 40 yards plus to kind of separate Clemson from feeling like they're in this game heading into the fourth versus we're not really in touch with Louisville right now. That was a huge third quarter to come out of halftime and put 9 on the board. And look, in a perfect world, some of those are touchdowns, and it's even more impressive. But big time third quarter for Louisville.
Yeah, and this is big specifically for this Louisville defense. But the defense, they've been a weak point for this slide that they've been on. They've lost 3 of their last 5 games. After that 3-0 start, they were allowing 33 points per game over their last 5, and it was big time. They stopped them on a 4th down conversion at one point, and they did everything they needed to get a win here. But this is also just disaster for Clemson because they're likely on the outside looking in. As it stands right now, they have to win the ACC championship in order to make it to the college football playoff. 2 losses in the ACC is just it's not going to be good enough. And the fact that you've now lost to the 2 best teams you've played this season also does not say good things about your football program. Another big thing that happened in the ACC, an undefeated Pittsburgh team, they got smashed by SMU. They didn't just get beat. Brashard Smith, he powers his way to 161 yards and 2 touchdowns. Kevin Jennings was dominant. He had 306 yards and 2 touchdowns. But, I mean, Jennings in particular was somebody who I was looking at to really rebound. He did that in a big way. He had 5 of SMU's 6 turnovers in that overtime win against Duke. He was one of the biggest reasons why they pummeled Pitt in the first half. They rode some big plays and sprinted to a 31-3 halftime lead. And really, I mean, this game was over at that point. They led 48-11 before Pitt found any offense at all. They finished with 453 yards of total offense. Pittsburgh does. 300 of that came after halftime, after they started kind of cruising there in the second half. They had already trailed by 4 touchdowns in this game. But Mustangs have won 6 in a row after an 18-15 home loss against the still undefeated BYU team. I mean, that's their only loss in their past 13 home games. And they've averaged 50 points per game in those contests. This is a really good SMU team, and I think it's time that people start taking them seriously.
Well, I just want to say 2 things about what's going on here. And first off, this is essentially a flip in the ACC. Where Pitt is where SMU now is. And so Clemson's the one who really takes the dip because they got a couple of teams. But SMU is now running away, and they can handle their business. Potentially, they can be there. And then the other thing I just want to say quickly about SMU, if you go back to you and I having discussions in the offseason. We talked about SMU quite a bit, a number of times about how pesky they could be if they could be a fly in someone. And a lot of that was based on the performance of what we thought would be starting quarterback Preston Stone. And he really struggled out the gate. SMU didn't look like the world beaters you and I thought they might be. They make the quarterback change. It has been Kevin Jennings. And oh, look, they're the world beaters now that we thought they could be. They are a team that is going to come into the ACC and was going to be an issue for a lot of programs. It just didn't get there as quickly or necessarily with the personnel you and I maybe thought. But we did both of us felt SMU was going to be a problem, and right now they are.
Yeah, and Pittsburgh was looking to go 8-0 for the first time since Dan Marino was throwing the ball around back in 1981. But SMU, they're 5-0 in their first ACC season. They are in the driver's seat, along with these guys, the Miami Hurricanes. They pound Duke in the fourth quarter. This is another one of those games where the scoreline looks a little bit more lopsided than it actually was. Miami continues to flirt with disaster. The Canes went from trailing by 11 to winning by 22 points against Duke. They scored 50 points now for their fifth time this season, and they ruined Manny Diaz's homecoming, his first time down there since being fired in 2021. They went on a 28-3 run after trailing 14-0 in the first quarter. But I mean, Miami does what Miami does, and they explode in the second half. They go on a 36-3 run in a span of barely more than a quarter. The offense is just electric. I mean, what more can I say about Xavier Restrepo and Cam Ward than I haven't already? That duo has been absolutely tremendous. The best 1-2 punch in all of college football as it sounds right now. But they keep toying around with these games, and eventually it's going to burn them.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just so tough to get a read on them. But at the same time, you're looking at the rest of their schedule, right? They got at Georgia Tech, home against Wake Forest, at Syracuse. Like, they probably don't need to necessarily bring everything they have and still be able to win that game. They didn't do that against Duke, right? It was a sloppy first half, and they still find their way to get the points on the board when they need to. This team, whether you like them or not, whether you think they're really that squad or not, there's a really good shot of them being 12-0 heading into the ACC title game.
Yeah, it's very realistic, if not probable at this point, that they are not going to get tripped up at any point. I mean, they're a good football team. I've got a lot of respect for what they can do on offense, but I need to see some more consistency. Because over your last 4 weeks or so, 5 weeks, you had that game against South Florida. That's where it really all started. They were not very good for a large swath of that game, but then they pour it on. They win that game 50-15. The Virginia Tech, where there's a very real chance that they lose that game, they win it at the buzzer. Same thing can be said about California. Same thing can be said about Louisville. Florida State, they look pretty good, but that's one of the worst teams in college football against Florida State. And then there's this one against Duke. It's a very consistent theme. Syracuse on the road is not going to be an easy test. Syracuse also got a big win over Virginia Tech this weekend. That's a solid bunch. They've also shown that Kyle McCord, I mean, if he throws 5 interceptions in a football game, makes it pretty hard to win. But we saw him do that against Pittsburgh. But look, Syracuse can take your lunch money if you give them an opportunity. Wake Forest, Georgia Tech, I don't know if they're going to have the firepower. If Georgia Tech coming off of a bye week, maybe, because Brent Key does weird things against ranked ACC opponents. He finds a different gear that some people don't think he has. But look, I don't know if anybody's going to come up with any answers for Miami in the ACC. SMU and Clemson are probably the only teams that I could think of. Neither of those teams are going to see them. So Clemson may miss Clemson entirely, which for them, I guess, would be an absolute blessing. But Malik Murphy and this Duke offense, they were good for a while until they weren't. 325 yards for the quarterback, Malik Murphy, and he throws 3 touchdowns, but he also gets intercepted 3 times, and he has a fumble that is recovered by the opposition. So tough game there for Duke, but Miami just continues to roll. Let's move over to the Big 12. Kansas State, they have their season derailed by Houston. They already had very slim margin for error after the loss to BYU earlier this season. They lose this game 24-19. A perfect example of why losing a turnover battle can mean so much. Kansas State, they outgained Houston. Cougars only had 111 yards passing and 123 yards rushing. They had 21 first downs compared to just 10 for Houston. The Cougars also only convert 3 of their 12 first downs, but Avery Johnson throws 2 picks, and that's really the biggest difference in this game. Houston, they get the 14-0 fourth quarter, and Willie Fritz, I mean, he gets another big win. Second week in a row that they get a big one. They beat Utah last week, and Kansas State was just flat in this game. I mean, I think it had a lot to do with the 55-minute lightning delay, a lot of weather problems out there in the West, in the Big 12 conference. May cost them a chance at a Big 12 championship, though.
Yeah, this one felt like it may have been coming for a while. Obviously, the loss of BYU, but it was a tight game against Colorado. It was a tight game against Kansas. I know they did blow out West Virginia in the meantime, but for a team I would have been very high on in Kansas State and quarterback Avery Johnson, it just didn't feel like they were necessarily handling opponents like I thought they should be, like a potential top 10 team was. And now it's shown by Houston. They certainly are not that. And with that loss, the Big 12 race has gotten very interesting.
Yeah, and let's continue that discussion right here. Texas Tech snaps Iowa State's perfect record. They get a 23-22 win. The Red Raiders, I mean, they dropped consecutive games to Baylor and TCU. They were one of those sneaky good teams that they were kind of like what SMU and Pittsburgh were in the ACC. They just kept hanging around, and then all of a sudden they dropped those 2 games, and everyone kind of hit the panic button on the Red Raiders there. But Taj Brooks, no one panics about him. He continues his tremendous season. He had 122 yards and a touchdown in this one. He's got 100 yards or more in all 8 of his games this season. He's got a touchdown in 7 of those 8 games. He actually just went over the 4,000-yard mark in his career for the Red Raiders. He might go down as one of the best running backs in that program's history. But Morton, he leads that offense down the length of the field. 12 plays, final 2 minutes of the game. They scored 19 seconds left. I thought that I saw Iowa State had taken the lead late in this game, and I thought that was going to be all she wrote for them. But Iowa State's been kind of playing around with this fire in the same way that some of these other big teams, Pitt's been doing it, Miami's been doing it. Iowa State finally gets burned with this. UCF, West Virginia, Iowa, they've never really felt super comfortable, but they were undefeated, and until they got beat, you had to ride with that team. But they have shown time and time again that they struggle with stopping the run, and that's what kills them eventually against Texas Tech on this one.
Yeah, and receiver Josh Kelly had half the damage through the air. He had 2 touchdowns, and he was a problem. This was a crazy final couple of minutes in this game, and badly missed field goals, turnovers, 1 or 2 play scoring drives. Very wonky final couple of minutes. I was at the cocktail party, as I mentioned. I started watching other games. This was the first one I had pulled up because it was all over the place in the final 5 and 6 minutes of this fourth quarter. But look, Iowa State's still a good team, but you're right. They've been playing with danger, and it finally cost them. You knew Taj Brooks is a problem. He's been a problem for a while. And you're right about Texas Tech as a squad too. I mean, this is a team that is 6-3, and they had stumbled the past couple of weeks, and people kind of looked away from them because they had been, I want to say, 5-1 at a point, and people stopped looking at them, but they showed that they can still be dangerous. And again, complete change in what's going on with the Big 12 now. Colorado in prime, back in the discussion.
They're right there at 6-2 and 4-1. That's actually exactly where I was going to go. I do want to talk about the Big 12 standings as it stands right now. BYU is the cream of the crop right now. They are undefeated. They finished the season. They got a trip to Utah. They've got Kansas. Don't forget about Arizona State. And then they finish with this Houston squad. Iowa State, they're sitting at 7-1, 4-1. They are still in second place. Still control their destiny. Matt Campbell's squad does. But they have a trip to Arizona State, Cincinnati, and Kansas State. That's a tough final month of the season. Colorado, they're sitting at 6-2 and 4-1. They finished with Utah, Kansas, and Oklahoma State. Pretty manageable. Probably the most manageable of this bunch. Kansas State, you've got Arizona State, Cincinnati, and Iowa State. That's a slog in the Big 12 conference. This conference, one thing to keep in mind, Arizona State, they're still right there in the thick of it alongside of Cincinnati and Texas Tech and West Virginia. They all sit with 2 conference losses. And the one theme that all of those teams, except for Colorado, have in common, they all play Arizona State. Arizona State can absolutely play its way into a Big 12 championship game situation. I don't necessarily think that's going to get into that scenario, but Arizona State has a very good chance of, at least causing some problems in the conference and maybe throwing a wrench into it. But this conference has started to cannibalize itself, and this is kind of what we expected to happen. Everybody except for BYU, who's just riding high on top of the conference as it stands right now. So let's go into this final bit of the show right here. College football playoff. It is releasing its rankings here coming up on Tuesday. I have my predictions. I'm sure you have some for of your own. I'm just going to roll through this 12 to let's go 1 to 12. And I'm going to follow yours, and I don't know what yours are. You don't know what mine is. I'm more worried about who the teams are than I am where they actually stand outside of your top 4, right? So This isn't how it's going to finish. It's how you would put it right now. But Abe, you can go first.
Yeah, and right now I just ranked 12 teams. I didn't, like you saying, I didn't put conference champions in the top 4 and buys and all that. So my top team would be Oregon.
I agree. Yeah, it's fine.
Georgia 2.
That's fine.
Ohio State 3.
That's it.
It might get messy, but Texas 4.
I got Miami.
I have Miami right after him, 5.
And I have Texas right there. That's fine.
Okay, so I understood that flip. Again, I don't care about the record. If I took those 2 teams on the field right now, I think I'd still take Texas. I'm jumping up a couple spots. I got Indiana at 6.
I have Indiana at 6 too. They're undefeated, and they're winning by impressive margins.
And quite frankly, I might consider Indiana over Miami, but maybe we're starting to get some homerism going. What do we at? Indiana 6. I got BYU at 7.
I'm sitting at Penn State at 7.
I have Penn State at 8. So right behind BYU at 7.
I've got BYU at 8.
So we just flipped. So far, we flipped
just
Texas,
flipped.
Miami.
So we're pretty consistent.
Okay, that's 8. What do I got? 9. I got Tennessee.
I got Tennessee.
Boise State 10.
No, I got Boise State sitting at 12.
Okay, who do you have at 10?
10 is Notre Dame.
Okay, we are still flipping because I have Notre Dame at 12.
There you go.
And should we say it at the same time and hope we have? Yeah. I was gonna say Bama in the middle. So we're not
actually pretty consistent. That's not bad.
We do have the same 12-team field, and quite frankly, once you got to probably Penn State, Tennessee, Boise State was going to be in, I guess, but like Tennessee, Alabama, Notre Dame are kind of in by default, only because I don't know if I believe the teams below them right now. Obviously LSU could prove something. A&M, SMU may start to enter this discussion, but they're not there just yet.
Yeah. So do you have a couple of teams that are on the outside looking in? One thing that I do want to note, we both only have one ACC team.
Yeah.
We both only have one Big 12 team. I think that's pretty much how it's going to be. You have your group of 5 that's represented. That's great. You have an independent team that's thrown a wrench into the hopes for the Big 12 and the ACC. But really, it's the Big 10 and SEC show.
Where there's the 2 caveats, though. And this is where it gets tricky. Because we're parlaying Miami as an undefeated ACC champ. We're parlaying BYU as an undefeated Big 12 champ. If they both go 12-0 and they both lose in those championship games, would they both still get in? And I think that's where it starts to get tricky.
Depends.
Yeah, I know. I'm not asking you to answer it. I'm saying that's where it starts to get tricky. Is if you got BYU and Miami will be top 5 still at that time. BYU will certainly be in the top 10. They're not going to drop from where they are now. They might be as high as 7 or even 6, potentially 5 on their own. You might have 2 top 5 teams undefeated lose on championship weekend. And are you really going to drop them both out of the top 12? I mean, that's the discussion for the committee, not for you and I, thankfully.
I think at that point, it just sort of gets a little bit more complicated. Are you going to drop a one-loss BYU team who, assuming they run the table, say, would you put in a 2-loss Alabama team over them? I probably would, but again, the committee is going to have a very difficult task,
and it'll sort itself out too.
Exactly.
Like, I mean, we both had Tennessee. Yeah. Like Tennessee's going to have to play Georgia, so they might be bounced out, which opens up a spot, and SMU. It'll all sort itself out.
Yeah, and look, the final month of the season. I said this on the podcast on Thursday again too. This is a slog. This is a tough final month of the season, especially for some of these teams who aren't used to being in this territory. I mean, this is what happens when Iowa State plays and they're undefeated in the month of November. This is what happens when Indiana plays and they're undefeated in the month of November. They don't know. Because Indiana's a 9-0 for the first time in program history. That's huge for them. So we don't know what they're going to do. And look, year to year, whatever, things change and whatever, but I think it's going to make for a very compelling final month of the season. And all the more reason to follow along the College Football Overtime podcast. We do this twice a week. We hope you follow along with us. We have a lot of fun talking about it. Abe Gordon, Garrett Chapman here on the College Football Overtime podcast. So follow along, give us a like, make sure to subscribe, follow, and we'll talk some ball. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Week 10 reaction show for Abe Gordon. My name is Garrett Chapman. We are College Football Overtime. We'll see you again very soon.